ado.
All right, thank you, everybody. I have to say you're a dedicated bunch for staying so late on a Friday evening. So thank you very much. So I work for Accenture, and I'm a lead for Accenture, working at the North American practice. I spend the majority of my time spinning up DevOps capabilities within large projects, yeah. And this presentation is really about some of the experiences I had with kind of scaling up a DevOps practice in a fast-running project. So who hasn't heard of Accenture? Put your hands up. There's a few of you. That's good. So what Accenture does is that we're an IT consulting company. We tend to work with very large enterprises. So my current role is that I'm working in Seattle for a very large mobile IT company, and I actually run the DevOps practice within that organization. Okay, so the agenda that I'm going to be covering today, I'm going to be talking about some of the things that I've come across whilst running these projects. I'm going to talk about branching and merging and how that impacts risks, pitfalls, and how to manage environments at scale, configuration management, or the lack of, and how to automate it. And then we're going to talk about beyond pipelines, talk about how we customize dashboards based on data that you pick up during the deployment process. So what is unique about Enterprise DevOps product, or project? The first thing is that because I work in a consultancy company, when we engage by a client, we have to hit the ground running really, really fast. There's no time to kind of get into conversations about requirements. All of that kind of stuff had to be done up front, and you need to hit the ground running. So when we approach a project, we have many developers, and for better or worse, a lot of our development is done across the globe. So we have to have a DevOps practice that spans 24/7 and actually cater the needs for a global distributed development team. That means there's a lot of continuous integration, there's a lot of builds. We need to scale the infrastructure. We're doing hundreds of builds a day and doing hundreds of deployments per day. We manage an incredible amount of infrastructure as well. And as I go deep into this conversation, I'll explain how we actually support many different types of testing, which results in many different types of environments. Then I'm going to talk about how to automate and manage multi-tier applications. I think that's one of the hardest things I found is that how do you manage an application that's very complex, has multiple tiers? What we've done in this project in Seattle is an Angular application with an Apigee backend. It has a lot of different proxies, and the Apigee layer then interfaces to a backend. When you have a complex application like that, it's very difficult to manage the configuration of a multi-tier application, and also scaling that to many different environments as well. So let's talk about the first thing. So branching strategy. I think a lot of people don't spend enough time actually realizing that actually if you do software development for a large project, your branching strategy is one of the fundamental things that you have to get right. It actually determines the cadence of your release process. In fact, I go far as saying that your branching strategy is the blueprint of your release process. Now, there's two extremes of it. So if you do too much, well, let me back up. So what branching is there for is really to give you abstraction, and also it will give you deference as well, meaning that you can start a whole branch of work without impacting the main line of development. But also, by doing so, you're actually deferring that work because you're going to be merging those features and functionality into the main line at some point. However, if you do too much branching, you're actually impacting the feedback. So there's a notion of trunk-based development, which a lot of open source projects do. So basically, any new feature or any new piece of work gets committed straight to the trunk, and you get instant feedback because your continuous integration is actually configured to point to the trunk. For a lot of people, that's probably in a large organization having multiple applications. That's sometimes too much for you, and you're causing too much disruption. So there's a fine balance there. Also, the other extreme, I've walked into projects where they've done absolutely no branching whatsoever. The people are randomly committing, there's no organization, there's no branching structure. And actually, one particular project, it's one of the root causes of why that particular project failed. Because there was no structure around the branching process, the actual release process was very, and it's extremely difficult to release a consistent product. So you have to tailor your branching strategy to actually match how your team is doing development. So some of the key things that you need to consider: the size and composition of your dev team. Okay, and that kind of determines a couple of things. So if you're going to do feature level branching, sprint level branching, and how often you actually merge into the main line using pull requests. Also, another key component is that if you have many different dependencies, application dependencies, how do you structure that out? Do you have a separate repo or a unified repo? All of these things impact the way that you manage your branching and merging strategy. I've given an example here of, unfortunately it's a little bit small, but essentially a Git flow process. It's a pretty common branching merging strategy. That, one of the key things with Git flow, you can get a little bit carried away with the amount of branches that you have. But there is a correlation between the branches and also your environment management as well. So all of these things tie together with your branching and merging strategy. So branching and merging ties with your release process, and it also ties into your environment management process. Because with the Git flow process, each branch, typically you take that package, you build on that, and you deploy it to a particular environment, and you promote that through the particular life cycle. So fundamentally, one of the things that what I do is when I go into any particular project is make sure that we've got a solid branching and merging strategy, because that dictates many different things. Okay, so next, what I found with these large-scale projects is that, I came from a background where, we built a build architecture using Jenkins, master and slave. But it's like, we use technology that's kind of was built for kind of a work group scenario. So when you try to scale up like a Jenkins master and slave architecture to a large scale, what you find is it ultimately fails nearly every single time. Last two projects I've had, one of the biggest fundamental issues was actually having a stable build farm, supporting literally hundreds of developers, hundreds of builds, and also literally hundreds of deployments per day as well. So, the common issues that we found with tools like Jenkins is that lack of executors. So basically, we've moved to a more scalable model where we're actually spinning up executors on demand. But, again, that only resolves some of the problems, yeah? So what we found was there were things like disconnects of slaves. This is a common issue, like when you're running an AWS infrastructure and you got infrastructure in between the slave and the master, you find that there disconnects in communication. So we moved from JNLP to SSH to minimize some of those issues. The next thing is that we run into a lot of memory issues with the master. Yes? So essentially, what we found is some of the threads would get blocked by plugins, etc. But the key thing what I'm trying to say in here, when you move to a large-scale project, not only is it scaling up your production environment, you actually have to scale up and manage your build and actually deploy and development infrastructure as well as if it was production. So you have to take that mindset and shift it away from, I'm just providing you a bunch of build servers. You actually have to design your build environment with high availability. We've had some success with CloudBees, but this is actually a work in progress at the moment, so we're gradually working through this. And what we found is that there's lots of different ways that your build infrastructure can fail. So another key thing that was very different when I took large-scale projects is that there are a lot of different types of environments. Obviously moving to an AWS, Chef, Puppet type infrastructure, it actually makes infrastructure and application stacks easier to obtain. The downside of that is that there's a proliferation of servers, and every team wants their own environment. So, I'm still staggered today at how many different types of environments that we have that support testing. We have test environments, we have UAT, dev, we have test environments for financial control, also data migration, stage, and prod. What it all adds up to is that we have literally hundreds and hundreds of servers. And the last AWS bill that we got on the project was 100K for the month, yeah, just for AWS services. So we're actually looking at ways now to kind of reduce. So we've actually made it we made it too easy for people to get hold of services. So we're actually making moves to actually reduce the number of services by bringing in containers and Dockerization, so that all those development level environments, they actually get moved so that the developers can maintain those containers themselves. So we're building a Docker infrastructure where they can actually register their Docker containers and actually maintain the Docker infrastructures themselves. So we're moving to that. So other things that we've implemented was AWS tagging, so we can identify where the infrastructure is being used, so we can do appropriate charge back. And other strategies are mocking and stubbing for development as well. So on those development environments, basically we minimize the amount of infrastructure we need by actually mocking out key services using either home-built mocking or using service virtualization as well. So I want to talk about configuration management. So this is another key thing that we found was very problematic in a large-scale project. So if you take a free-tiered application, this is fairly common. In this particular case, we had a user interface, Apogee interface, a AngularJS user interface. We had Facade, which is an Apogee layer, which manages the API interface between the UI and the backend, and also a content management system, Adobe Experience Manager. If you take that three-tiered application and you work out the numbers of different permutations of configuration across simply 5 environments, you come to like 60 different permutations. So the challenge here is managing environment-specific configuration across multi-tiered application in a very consistent way. So you can use tools like Puppet and Chef, but what we did was, we use Ansible, but what we did for configuration was that if you take a configuration, standard configuration like Apache HTTP, so you got configuration tokens and you have values. Those values are typically environment specific, yeah? So what we did was this is the notion of configuration as code. You take that configuration and you actually break it into 2. You have the base configuration tokens are typically the same across all your environments, and then you have your values which are environment specific. So basically we put those into Git repository. You can do this with Subversion, but you version control it. Okay. Once you have that, we actually, during the build process, during the Jenkins deployment process, what we do when we deploy a particular application, we reach back into the Git repository, and we actually pull those to the template itself and also the values, and we bundle that as part of the deployment process. What we then do is we actually upload that into Artifactory so that we have a copy of the configuration values, and also we actually parse it into a JSON format. And that JSON format is very important because we use that JSON format of the configuration, environment-specific configuration for that application, and we put it into a data store, which we've written an Angular application for, and we actually created a self-serve configuration dashboard. So one of the things that was a real pain for us was that we would have teams come to us and say to us, this application works in XYZ environment, but when it was promoted to the next environment, it broke. Yeah? It's the same build, So what's changed? So ultimately, it's usually configuration that has changed. So basically, what we did was rather than us spend lots of time comparing the configuration of one, but we actually turned it into a self-service and actually pushed it onto the business or some other team to actually be able to review the configuration itself. So by having a JSON object and having this dashboard render it, we could actually build functionality where you could actually different versions of the configuration, or even compare environment to environment and actually see what the differences were as well. So we actually pushed that into a self-service model. By doing so, it gave us a couple of advantages. Not only just the configuration as well, but we actually extended this further, and I'll talk about this, to the whole the build process. And I want to talk about when I say the whole build process. When you look at a multi-tiered application, you're actually releasing different versions of the application, different versions of the configuration. Unless you have this concept of a release bundle that identifies that particular release across multiple tiers of the application, it's actually very difficult to actually consistently promote it to one environment to another environment. So I'll give you an example. So this application that we was responsible for, this Angular UI, Apigee layer, AEM, each build had their own build number, but also each configuration was versioned as well. So when you deploy that to multiple different environments, it's actually quite a challenge to get it into a consistent state. So what we did was that we created, and we actually wrote an application. We created a universal release bundle. That bundle number actually identify all of the application at different. So UI a version number, AM a version number, and all the configured, so we can consistently release that release across multiple tiers. And we actually created that into a JSON object, so you could actually read the JSON and actually see what was in that universal build. So we could identify the AM content, we could identify the UI build, UI configuration, the AM configuration. Part of the application stack was also Lambda as well, so we could identify the Lambda configuration. So we we had metadata about the actual release itself. And it's actually quite powerful when you do this, because in that particular build, you could put other JSON objects, other identifiers to actually identify what part of the pipeline that build was actually being promoted to. So if you were doing things like functional testing, and as you flow through the pipeline, you can actually put into the JSON object that actually did this particular release pass, this level of functional testing, did it pass performance testing. So basically, we have metadata about the application release itself. When you take that data, because it's in a JSON format, what we could do is then actually do reporting on it. Unfortunately, it's very unclear on here, but we could actually create dashboards around that metadata, that JSON object. So we could actually say, for this particular environment, it had this particular release on it. You could actually click on it. The JSON object would open up, and you could see all the different application tiers within there with the application releases in there. So that was basically, I wanted to kind of point out to you that, that was a very creative way, that I think is a very creative way that we tackled that particular problem. So, without such a solution, deploying to many different environments, you actually would have to actually go in, do the deployment, and actually watch the deployment itself. So if you're anyone familiar with Apigee, you actually, you might realize that deploying proxies to Apigee is quite cumbersome. So you have to essentially 30 different proxies. By doing this, we could actually consistently deploy it to any of the environments. Now, pulling that all together. So this is the kind of pipeline in a very detailed slide on all. And basically, here I got the the branching at the top, we have the tools in the middle, the artifacts that we manage, and also an environment. So all of these things are key to actually running a consistent continuous integration or continuous delivery pipeline. So at the top, this is the Git flow process that I talked about. Basically, here you have dev teams managing their own development branches. Basically, they're running in a sprint model, so there's sprint branches for each of the teams. There'll be pull requests, and once the pull requests have been authorized, they would merge into the dev branch. That again would trigger off a deployment build process, and basically we then would do automatic deployments to the development environments and also to the demo environments as well. But these are all the tools that were part of our continuous integration tool chain. So all of these had, basically provide you the whole build pipeline, all the way from build, unit testing, functional testing, non-performance, non-functional testing as well, and also deployment processes. So basically all of these tools were integrated to some level. So we used the plugins from Jenkins and Rally to make sure that when people committed code, it was associated to tasks and stories within Rally, so you had that level of traceability. Bitbucket, obviously that's our Git repository. We actually chose to use pull request as the method to make sure that the code had been reviewed and then actually merged after pull request had been approved. We'd actually then do the merges. We triggered, obviously Jenkins is like the de facto CI build server. We use CloudBees. We haven't had much success with, and that's, I guess, another story, but we haven't had that much success using Jenkins on a high-scale project, yeah? So I'm still looking out for a different solution on that. Unit testing. Okay, unit testing, we because it's an Angular app, we use Mocha and Chai for the unit test, and we tied that into Sonar. So every time we built, we actually triggered off a Sonar job and actually have a dashboard of metrics around that particular build, and that's used to improve the code quality around the particular project. And as we move further to the right, we chose to use Ansible as our deployment, our system configuration management tool, rather than Puppet and Chef. What I found in a lot of projects is that depending on the type of skills that you have on the project, kind of determines what the skills that determines the tools that you should choose. On a previous project, I had a really tough time finding people that were skilled in Chef. It's a very high demand skill, and the same with Puppet as well. And I come from a system administration background, and a lot of my team does. And so we found that using Ansible was a better way to go. It's easier to pick up, and the learning curve wasn't so great. So we actually use kind of exclusively Ansible for our deployment process. Yeah, so we actually trigger it during, we use Jenkins for the orchestration and the deployment process, but also we actually then call Ansible to actually do the deployment itself. On the test automation side, we have all of that is automated. One of the things that we learned on the test automation side is that it's actually better to go to a provider like Source Labs rather than to build your own test automation infrastructure. We just didn't have the bandwidth to build our own test automation infrastructure. And when we did, we found it was a little bit clumsy, not as accurate as it should be. We actually built a scalable, we use Selenium and Protractor, and we use Docker to actually spin up containers that actually would do would actually do the functional testing. But what we found was that we would get better results if we use Source Lab. So really, I guess the lesson learned from that is that just be careful in terms of when you start scaling up. sometimes it's better to actually look at services that are already available. We're at a part of the project now is that we're going to bring in security into the pipeline as well. And something that hasn't really been talked about here is that how to bring security as part of your deployment pipeline. So one thing we're going to be doing is looking at ways to integrate Veracode into the continuous deployment process as well, continuous delivery process. We're looking at IBM App Scan. So we're looking at some of these proprietary tools and looking at ways of how we can integrate. I think we're going to have some challenges around IBM App Scan. But as you can see, on the back end of it, there's many environments shared. So basically, these are all the environments that we're deploying to. So basically, we're trying to eliminate a lot of the development environments and containerize those so we can minimize environment costs. But on the middleware and also on the as we move further into the pipeline, a lot of these environments that we do want to move to containers, but at the moment we're kind of stuck with AWS. And I've been given a 2-minute countdown. So I come to the end of the presentation, and I realized that it was late. So I wanted to give some time to talk about, basically get any feedback or any questions and answers. And basically, give some advice on people on how to scale up a kind of a DevOps capability in a fast-running project. Yeah. Yeah.
You've highlighted a bunch of different tools that you can drop into a variety of different situations to
Yeah.
achieve the outcome you're looking for.
Sure.
In many of these large enterprises, at the end of that project, you still have the same developers that have been there for 20 years thinking about things the same way that they always did, and basically you craft a beautiful wrench. So
Yeah.
how do you wind up handling the cultural aspect of those transformation projects?
I've spent a lot of time kind of preaching culture, but culture is extraordinarily hard to change. And when you're running a fast-running and this is just my view of it, sometimes you can't change culture. Culture is the way it is. So, but you can change the way people work through automation. Yeah. So that's one way to attack it. So there is the end goal, the long goal, which is changing the culture, but it means working with a different set of people. It's long term, but in my experience, I don't have that luxury. I go into a project. I've got 6 months, yeah, and so I got to develop a product in 6 months, getting ready. I don't have time to change culture, and so I'm a little jaded about the cultural side of it. And there's a few smiles around it. Yeah, it's, and quite frankly, it's very difficult. So what I do, we tend to focus on the tools and the automation and changing the way people work from that perspective. Yeah. It may not be the answer that you want, but that's the, yeah.
Sometimes it's your only hope.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, really, just extend collaboration as much as you can.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely right. Any other questions? As you see from my presentation, I deal mainly with the left side of DevOps. It's mainly focused on the development side, working in development teams. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So you guys should roll out anything to keep things looking good later, right? Like monitoring and whatnot, not just get the product out the door, but give somebody something to help keep it going afterwards.
Yeah, we do. It's it's not about writing a product and doing a runner after the fact. Is that we're aggressively pursuing things like tying more DevOps, focusing more on the operational side of DevOps. So we're tying in things like Splunk monitoring, app dynamics. but also from a business perspective as well. So, I think one of, as Jason mentioned, one of the key things that we don't pay much attention to monitoring is the business side of monitoring. And so a lot of the monitoring now we're kind of focused on with Splunk and App Dynamics is actually getting quantifiable, qualitative information about basically your application or even your products itself, yeah? So be able to do A/B type testing and actually release small increments to one side of a stack and actually release it gradually to an audience, actually using tools like App Dynamics and Splunk to actually measure, basically, did it actually do what it was intended? Did that feature that we released actually do what it said? So there's a whole kind of business around that. So it's just to point, it's not just about releasing an application, it's about the ongoing business, getting measurement from an application, feed that back into the product, and actually the development of the product itself as well. Yeah. No last questions? Okay, thank you.
This was fun. All right. So that was our last speaker for today. I'm just going to put up a map real quick for those of you who are not from around here, or if you are from around here and have no idea where the Basque Center is, I'll put up a map. It is literally 2 blocks down and like half a block up, so it's not too bad. 7 p.m. Thank you. And like we said, we've got food coming. There'll be I never pronounce her name. Likuona. The Basque restaurant is actually doing a bunch of appetizers and desserts as well. And we have beer, wine, and other drinks too. So come on down. Tomorrow morning we kick off at 9 a.m. So look forward to seeing you then as well. Thank you guys for coming.